Yeah, because it's always sending it someplace weird, because
Right.
I've been doing it wrong.
Right. All right, so today we're going to be talking about our next two projects, which is Project 2 and 3. It's called Realism Part 1 and Realism Part 2 because what you're going to be doing is the first part for Project 2, you're just working on the model itself and the geometry of some of these objects. So this is just the geometry with the default white material on it or a gray material, and these are the models themselves. And so right now you're going to be focusing on the geometry and just getting a simple, just the form of it. And what you're going to be doing with this project is actually you're going to be using it in here, but you're also going to be using it in the next class, which is the CSC 188 Computer Animations 2, and you're going to be using it to in a couple ways. You're going to use it as in a lighting study where you actually choose a light from a particular movie or image or something like that, and you recreate it, study the lighting of it. And this is color, this is full color, this is everything. And you're going to recreate a scene with this object in that scene with that lighting setup. So you're doing more like a set lighting or a lighting study. And then you're going to animate this object with some sort of movement like it's being moved by natural forces. Maybe it falls off the shelf and you look at how it would bounce on the ground, or it falls down the stairs, or something comes by and hits it and it gets shoved. And it's more from natural forces. So think about this object as being just kind of dropped or tossed. So I have, and one of the things that I want you to think about is it's something that you can look at and actually measure and touch, and that's somewhat interesting to look at. So it could be a kitchen appliance, it could be a tool, not an appliance like a refrigerator, although it could be. I'm talking about a utensil. I mean something that's not huge and not complex. It's mostly a single piece or something like that, but it has interesting features, but not too complex. So for instance, I have a bottle that I really liked. That's a bottle of cologne that it's a simple shape. It's got some cool features because it's got metal with some engravings on it. It's got leather on top with some stitching and some embossed texture or lettering. And then it's got a cool metal cap with some interesting textures on it. So this could fall, and the lid could fall off and slide across the floor, and it could spin or whatever. And it's simple enough to model and to texture in a project like this. So, and I can look at it, I can see it, I can measure it, I can really get a feel for how it looks. It's not just this abstract object or something that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? It's not like a laser gun from some game that you can't actually see. You don't really know what the size is. Unless you can get a good reference of what it actually looks like and how big it actually is, then we can't really discuss the details because we can't see it. You know what I mean? So I want it to be something that you can look at for real, and if you modeled it well enough, you could actually print it out and make it a physical object. And so things along those lines is what I'm looking for. You know, it's typically a single object or an object that's not made up of very many movable parts. It's not human. It's not a high detailed sculpture, but it's more along the lines of something, you know, that you would be using. But interesting, not so easy that you'll have it done in 5 seconds, right? It's a challenge, but not too complex. Does that make sense to everybody? And so that's what we'll be working on in this first part. So Realism Part 1, and then Realism Part 2 is adding the details and the colors and the surface textures to make it look like the actual object. And then we'll render it out, and it should look real. Like these things look pretty close to the final object or the actual object. So that's where we're going. So you can see you have clear plastic with with something underneath it with the letters and all that sort of stuff. So that's what we're doing. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? So I want you to be able to actually look at it so we can actually study something like that. So today we're going to just kind of look at box modeling, just simple modeling using this gas can as an example. And this is something that you'll be doing on your own looking at something, trying to model, like we did in our very first project. That first project is a lot of just kind of square, straight objects, you know, lots of kind of straight up. This is going to be a little bit more detailed. Well, when we're going to learn some more modeling tips and some more modeling tools to help create a little more organic and accurate models. Now there's still just a single, this isn't a single piece, but it's made up of a few different parts, and we'll just kind of look at getting the basic shape and form. And so that's the goal. So for instance, this model here, the gas can model, when I'm done with it, it might look something like this at the end, so you can kind of see the different geometry that I have. When it actually gets smoothed and I start to smooth it later on, you can see how the smoothing adds and holds the form of the object. I have a couple other parts here that we'll talk about a little bit different, how we would make this shape in an easier fashion than what we've done in the past. And this also has, the next step is when we start doing texturing, it actually has texture on it to give it those tiny little surface details like plastic would have, you know, like tiny little bumps. And I actually used a texture or a bump map to put the word fuel on there. So see how it has the word fuel. So instead of modeling that with geometry, sometimes you can use an image, a black and white image, to say, you know, this is raised and this is in, you know, pushed in. And so you can use a texture for that instead of using geometry. I chose to use geometry for this ridge around the edge, but I could have tried to do that. I could have done that with an image as well. So when we begin to think about this image represents kind of my initial thought. When I look at the model and I think of this object from my reference image, I immediately start kind of thinking at the lowest level of geometry, where would those extrusions come from and how would I kind of separate out the pieces. So if I started with just a cube, like we will start out, and I put in a couple edge loops here, and then if I extruded the edge loops up, these two faces here up a little bit to this level, and this face here up a little bit to this level, scaling it in a little, then I'm going to extrude it up a little bit, and then extrude this one up a little bit, and then connect them. Does that make sense? So before I even model, I at least have a game plan of what I think would work. And so that's my first step, is like I usually do this on the picture. I'll print it out or or draw it in on Photoshop, but I give myself kind of an idea of what I'm going to do, my game plan. So that's how I'm going to break it down. And as we go through this, you can kind of see that being done right here. Here's my original edges here, and then I extruded this up, and I extruded over. Then as I needed more detail, I added more edge loops to put in the little finger grips and that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit as I go approach, and then I'll created this in a different fashion. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do that very thing. So we're going to start with what's called we're going to start with a cube or a box, and we're going to do a series of extrusions in order to make this work. Does that make sense to everybody? So you should have from the web page under the advanced modeling gas can, I have an image there called gas can image plane, cleaned up. If you click on that, you can download that image, and then we're putting that in our source images folder, and then we're going to bring that into our scene. And now I'm going to clean up my spot. So get that ready. I'm going to start with a fresh. So remember, as we do this, we have a project folder. The project folder contains all of the resources that we're going to be using. In my case, I'm going to be doing a gas can. So in my gas can, I have my source images, and I have some extra ones in here. This is some of my images that I've used. And I have my source image, and then the same thing that we've been doing all along. The images that I render out will be here. But it's all contained within my source images, or within my gas can project folder. Everybody understand that? And because it's in my source images folder, my gas can reference image, when I go into my scene, I can choose the camera, the orthographic camera that I want to use, the front camera in this case, and I can go up to view, and I can say image plane, and I can import that, and it'll go into my source images folder, and then I'm going to choose my cleaned up gas can, and there it is in my scene. Now I'm going to use my tools or my transform tools to kind of make it a little bit more square. So I'm going to try to get about the middle of it. And I'm just going to kind of start with that. Is everybody able to do that? This is something we started with the hammer. And this is something that you should be doing, you'll be doing with your own. Now if you don't have reference images, if the object that you have is your own personal object, you take pictures of it, front, side, top, and you can make image references from whatever view that you need. And then you can actually have one in the front view and go into the side view and put another one in and line them up. And usually I will, when I make my reference images, I'll try to shoot them on a solid background of some sort. I mean, if it's small, I'll put a piece of paper or a big piece of paper and just kind of make a little, it's kind of like a little thing as a backdrop to shoot against, so I can keep any extra noise out of it. And then I can, if you know how to use Photoshop, you can remove backgrounds and that sort of stuff, just to clean things up. And I'll make my own reference images a lot, because I'll model something like this thing or whatever. And I'll make a lot of my own reference images, but I shoot them from an orthographic view, meaning I'm trying to get them square on as I can, because I'm going to be working on it from front, side, top, if I'm able, you know. So and so I do a lot of my own reference images. So once I have my image in place, I've already thought about my modeling procedure, which I think will work. It may or may not work. I didn't think about that. So sometimes you might model it, you might forget a detail. But what I'm not going to do is try to model the whole thing out of one piece. I mean, this is a separate object. There's no reason there's no reason to not model it as a separate object, right? I'm just doing the big green plastic part as a single object. I'll make a cap and this funnel, this spout as a separate object, and this as a separate object. So this is really 4 or 5 separate parts that make up this one final model. Does that make sense? And then I'll group that together. There's too many parts to try to make it all one, and besides, it's made out of different parts. And then I can focus on the details of one specific part instead of trying to get all of the details that would go into this to flow through this whole model. That would be way overkill and it wouldn't be appropriate. All right, does that make sense to everybody? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just basically be working in my front view. I'm going to begin by creating a simple polygonal cube. And if I go up to my polygonal cube button up here, I can click on this icon in my shelf, or I can go to Create Polygonal Primitives Cube and reset my settings if I need to, and then Create. Now I'm going to just kind of move this around a little bit, and I'm going to basically set it up a little bit so that my image and my model, I'm going to just move this around a little bit just to kind of get things. So what I want to do is keep my model kind of where that is, and then get my image plane to kind of line up to where I want at the moment. before I start kind of messing with things. So I'm just going to get it as clear as I can. And I'm also going to grab my image and move it back a little bit in my perspective view, so I'm not working right on top of it when I'm down here. When I'm in orthographic, and remember that we can adjust our viewing in a couple ways. So right now, if I hit 4 on my keyboard, I can see the wireframe, and I can see the outer edges of my object. If I hit 5, I see it shaded. And under my shading options up here, I can do the same thing. I can choose wireframe, shading. I could choose X-ray, which is kind of a transparent shading here, so I can still see my model or my reference image in the back. Now, if my reference image in the back is kind of annoying, I can select that, and I can go over to the shapes in my channel box. So here I am in my channel box, under my shapes input node, and the alpha gain value, if I click on that, on the name, and I middle mouse back and forth, I can actually turn the transparency value down. So between 0 and 1, I can actually make that semi-transparent too. So if it's, you can see how it's existing, but it's slightly transparent. So I can give myself a value over here that works for me. So I can kind of keep it out of my way and still see it. Does that make sense? So as you work, you'll find your own favorite ways to do it, or you may switch back and forth. I tend to switch back and forth from time to time. So if I look at my reference image, I'm basically starting with my cube, and this is my baseline for my top, and then the bottom is here, and I can add edges later on for that. So I'm going to keep things crazy simple, right? Super simple. Don't overdo it right now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in some edge loops in this to define this point and this point and this point. So I'm going to drop in 3 edge loops here, here, and here. All right? So under my mesh tools, I'm going to go into insert edge loop, as we've been doing. I'm going to click on that tool. Remember, the icon for that comes up over here. It looks like a plane with a dotted line across it. And if I double click that, I will actually get the tool settings for that tool. And these are the edge loop tool settings. If I wanted to add a bunch of edge loops into my scene, I could do so by changing some of these settings. If I wanted to add like 3 or 4 or 5 into my scene, I could adjust this. And then when I click on one edge, it will actually insert 5 edge loops in there. I don't want to do that. I'm just showing you that you can do that. If I want them to be equal distance from the edge, I can click on it. As long as I just click, it can pop it in. Now what I want to do is just say, I'm just going to put in one right here. I'm going to put in one right there. And I'm going to put in one right there. And I'm going to hit the Q button to turn that off. Now I'm going to go into my perspective view, make sure that it actually went around it and I don't have any stray problems because I just inserted a bunch of vertices and took them out. I'm just doing that because I could have added stuff I didn't want. So now I've simply defined some very key areas. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, I'm going to go back to my front view. So what I want to do now is just lift these 2 faces here and this face here up to this next level. So what I'm going to pull up is the face that's going to be on the top of this surface and on the top of this surface. So I'm going to go into my face mode. I'm going to grab this and this and this, and I'm going to check that out. So I've grabbed these faces here, and that is going to be visible. If I go into my wireframe, I can see that those faces on the top, those edges are illuminated, and that edge is illuminated. Does that make sense? and I'm simply going to extrude up. So I'm going to go to either my extrusion tool here. I can say extrude. I can say Control E, or I can hit this little button here that looks like a skyscraper sitting on a plane. So depending on what you want to do, I like using the Control E method sometimes. I don't always. Sometimes I'll just click on this. And what I want to do is I just want to lift straight up. I just want to lift straight up in, this is saying it's the blue arrow straight up. And if I move this, and as I move this icon up, notice that it's changing what's called my local translate Z value. If you can see that changing over there on the side right here as I lift this. So that's what that value is. So I'm just going to lift that up a little bit. I'm just going to lift it up to about right here. And so that's about 2.9 or whatever. I could type in a number if I wanted to. And I'm just going to deselect that for now. And this edge here looks pretty good, but this one's got a slope to it. So,
It was kind of a side question, but when you just deselected there, is there any way to go back to that? Like, say you deselected that extrusion, but then you wanted to change it again?
yeah, so if we went to, so we would go back to our object. Over in the inputs, we still have a little bit of history being saved. So if I click on that, I can still access it by clicking on this here. I can pull up this value, and I can actually, as I've done in the past, use the middle mouse slider button, when you slide it. Or if I click on the tool name here, I actually can get those controls again. But the one thing is that if the deeper you go in the stack of history, you can affect what happens after that. So if I went back to my first extrusion after I did 3 extrusions, then when I change that, everything up above is going to explode or change, which you could screw around with later on, but see what happens.
Well, I wonder why my locate translate Z didn't change. It's still 0, even though I did extrude like you just did.
Well, let's see. So So when you lifted it, how did you lift it? Did you just
did
lift
the
it with the little
faces.
blue?
I usually go to this,
Right.
so I don't see the other thing, because sometimes it's confusing to me. Is that why I didn't do it?
Yeah, it just,
Oh.
it didn't, you didn't lift it with, you basically lifted it with translation.
And you're not supposed to do that?
Well, I mean, you can, because you're elevating it, but it's just calculating it differently.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to go into my component mode, and this is where I could make some very minor tweaks, I would say. So I'm going to grab these 4, well, actually I could grab the 4 components, or I could just grab the face if I wanted to, and move them slightly back. So just basically I'm just going to angle it a little bit. So if I select these here, oh, actually, in my demonstration, let me back up a little bit. This one doesn't have to be that high. So I'm going to be using my vertices, and I'm going to just basically match these levels here, and I'm going to match this level here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this group of control vertices and angle it like that. And just try to match the form. I'm just basically tracing the outline of this object. And this is where we tweak. We can tweak the little edges as much as we can, but not too much detail right now. I'm just following the form. Does that make sense? I'm not dwelling on too much. And I could probably scale it in a little bit as well if I wanted to. And one way I could do that just to select these faces a little bit. And if I selected these faces, I could hit the scale tool and then just scale it down a little bit like this. So now I have a little bit of a slope. You can see how they slope in the reference image. You can't see it because I'm not looking at it from the side view, but this is straight up, but this slopes in. So I'm basically just trying to sculpt this a little bit by just scaling those faces in. So all I did was I selected the faces on top. Let me get that out of the way. Selected these faces. I go to my scale tool or the R shortcut, and then I just scale in Z a little bit, and I produce that little slope. Does that make sense? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just choose these faces, this face and this face. I'm going to extrude up again. So shortcut Control E, and if I use my blue Z depth, I can extrude up a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I will go in and just kind of take my face, and this is where I just kind of slide it a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just go down to the bottom of that. I'm going to take this face, just kind of go down to the bottom of this. And so what I want to do is I want to extrude up a little bit, and then I'm going to extrude across, or I could just continue. I'm imagining an angle kind of right here in my mind and then extruding across. So I have to get this crossbar, this bridge built across here. So this is where I could try it a couple different ways. I'm going to go into my vertex mode, and I'm working. I know that it looks like I'm just grabbing one vertex, but I should be grabbing both of those. And I'm just going to kind of go to the base here, and then looks like I'm grabbing one, but I'm grabbing both. And this is where I can kind of start to angle for that next extrusion. So I'm kind of just, I want to keep things as square as I can, but I can make some angle adjustments as I need to make the flow across. Does that make sense? Notice how I'm thinking the flow is going to follow like a tube across here. I'm going to do the same thing here. I might want to move these over a little bit. I might want to move these over a little bit. But you get the idea as I just kind of start to prepare for a little bit of a direction change. I'm not going to mess with, I'm not going to overthink or overwork my model. I'm just going to keep it as simple as I can. Everybody able to do that? So really I'm preparing to kind of make a tube that will, or a bridge that will go from here to here. Everybody able to do that? All right. So let's do this. Let's go into component mode face. So I'm going to right click on my object, choose face, and I'm going to take that face and this face and hit delete and delete them. So there's holes. You can see that this is just a big empty milk container. If you ever looked in a milk container when it's open, like a paper one. Anybody ever do that? Mm-hmm. It's so cool. All right, so we have this and this. And so one thing we could do is we could go into our edge component, and I could double click this edge, and I could extrude, and then extrude this out in the x-axis. But you'll notice that because that's at an angle, it wants to extrude out at an angle away, at a tangent away from that angle. I don't want it to do that. I'm going to use my cyclical index, and I'm going to cycle into world space orientation. Then I can just grab this and pull it straight across like that. And I can use my scale factor in X to make this kind of scale together like so. Everybody able to see that? Let me do that again. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to double click on this edge. And if I set extrude right now, it wants to pull it at the angle of the, based on the basically like the what's called a normal off that plane. And I don't want it to do that. So I can say, don't use that. Use the world space by clicking on this cycle index. I can't say it. Doesn't mean I don't know what it is. Right? Anybody know what that movie is from? Just because I don't know what it's called doesn't mean, forget it. All right, so I can, I think it's Ghostbusters. So if I cycle from here, it's going to pull out in a tangent. If I click on it, it's going to use world space, and then I can just move it this way, which is way easier than what I was doing. And then if I want, I can click on the round circle here, but that doesn't really look good. What I like to do is I'll just use the red cube scale factor and just scale it in. Does that make sense? Anybody able to do that? Jasper, you need help with something? Sure. You can actually model a whole thing by just doing edge extrusions. So if you extrude up and over and around, you don't always have to use faces. So there's lots of different approaches to modeling. So if you've got your edges here and here, we could extrude them together, or we can do something else that's called making a bridge. So let's try a couple things. I just want you to see different ways to make this come together. All right, so number one, if we were to just take this edge here, so I have it selected, and what I want to do is extrude across to here, and then what I'm going to do is called a weld. I'm going to weld them together, weld the components together, okay? So I have my edges selected, and only that. And I'm going to extrude, so Control E or shortcut, and I'm going to hit my little blue, someone said it looks like a power button, and I'm going to pull that in this direction, okay? Now, I'm going to deselect that. Now what we have are our components. We have vertices here, all the way around, or edges here. Oh, I'm sorry, those are faces. Edges all the way around. And this doesn't have any faces at the moment. So what we can do to connect these, because I'm trying to keep everything clean so they all line up nicely, we can weld them. And welding is a way to basically merge components together. Take one edge and another edge, make them one and connect them. Okay? So we can weld. So this is one method. So what we do is what's called target weld. And the target weld is at the very bottom of our mesh tools. And if we go into the options box, and I made a little video about this earlier, a week or so ago, we have two basic options. We have what's called the target, which means when I'm going to go to my vertex. When we choose the starting vertice, so I want this vertice to merge with the target, this one. So I would choose target, and I say this one, go to the target, boom. And it snaps them together and merges them. Now typically I am careful how I do this so that I can see as I go. So I wouldn't want to take this one and merge there when I had to work on all these across the road, right? So I'm going to work away from myself and work towards myself like I'm zipping things up. I'm going to take that and snap it to that target. And I'm not freaking out about this because I'm going to take that and snap it to that target. And then I'm going to take this and snap it to that target. And when I've done that, I have created a solid, completely molded together, welded object. Now I'm going to back up And I'm going to show you another way to do it. So if I wanted to, I could use target weld to do what's called center. So center is going to take the distance between the two components and merge them. So watch. This goes to this target and it merges them in the space between the two. That changes your geometry. Everything was lined up a minute ago and now that point is not in line with all the others. That may or may not matter to you, but it does sometimes when you want things to be clean and in the same space. So I can choose center or target. I'm going to right click on my object and choose edge, and I can actually say target edge, and I can say merge those edges. And then these two. But the hard part with edges is that last one. So I don't ever do that, actually. So I don't do that. I usually do the vertice. So I'll simply say go to target, and I'm going to say go here, go there, and then go there. And just make sure you don't accidentally snap them to another vertex somewhere else, because I could snap them to any vertex all around this model. And it's very easy to get confused with where you're going. All right? So there's a way to connect those objects, one part of an object to another. Let me show you another one. There's another one called, so let's pretend that, this hadn't happened yet. So I'm going to take these faces and delete it. And I have these edges, and I'm going to double click on these. So I'm holding down Shift and I'm double clicking on these edges. So I have a series of edges here which are the same in number as a series of edges here. So I have this edge loop and this loop of edges. And what I want to do is say, you know what, I could extrude this out and then weld it all together, but what if there was maybe a way to do it in a better way? So there's called a bridge tool. And the bridge tool, as long as you have two sets of equally numbered faces, so I'm going from, 4 edges to 4 edges, I can make a bridge. So I would try this. So I'm going to edit, reset settings. And so there's different bridge types. I'm going to do I'm just doing a linear path with a number of divisions. I'll say 1 division, so it'll have basically an edge in the middle of them. And if I say apply, look what I just did. Boom. I just made a super simple bridge to fill that hole there, and it's merged and welded together perfectly in way less time than welding or all that. And if I wanted to, my division settings are still in my history, so if I wanted to add more, I could add more divisions by changing the attributes over there. Does that make sense? So now I have got a fairly decent form out of my object. Okay? So everybody have something like that? So in a relatively short amount of time, we have the basic shape of a semi-organic object. And now is when I might start tweaking things just a little bit, maybe making the handles smaller or bigger or whatever. But let's say we wanted to add those finger grips. So this is where, and I wouldn't start doing this until I had most of all the geometry in, but I could go back to my edge loops. And I could add edge loops in the handle where I want them. And the mesh tools, insert edge loop. And then if I wanted to add a little more detail, I could add a little more detail on the sides of my object here. And then just change things as I go along. So this gives me, because I'm just changing a little bit of the geometry, I could then just grab some of the components and add little subtle details like some finger grips and that sort of thing as I go along, and just very subtle additions to my model as I'm starting to put things in. Does that make sense? Now this is what I would do. Well, let me look at my reference. Okay, so my reference is back here. So I've got a little object that needs to come off the back here, and I have a little stem that might need to come up out of it right there. So what I could do is on this face right here, I could do what's called an in-plane face, or a uniform extrusion, sorry, in the space. So if I go down and I say extrude, but I don't move it up or down, right? I haven't moved it. I've got an extrusion, right? There's an extrusion here, but I haven't technically elevated it. I can scale that down in its own uniform space. And then I can just move that a little bit if I want. Then I have this face here that I could extrude up if I wanted to. And then this face here that I could extrude down again. And maybe make a hole or something like that. But so I could put the hole in for that or whatever. But I've added little pieces of geometry without adding too much. Does that make sense? I could do the same thing here if I wanted to. Add a inline or a uniform scale. I'm hitting G, and I could extrude that up a little bit. And I could shape that to be more like a square instead of a geometric shape like so. So I'm just kind of making spaces for this as I kind of go along. And then, again, as I shape this, I'm going to just use some very linear tools to try to do this. So I'm not digging in and trying to do anything super spectacular, or I'm not like trying to click on this and move it like this around. I don't want to do that because it's getting out of alignment with my surface, right? I'm doing everything in a planar X, Y, Z manner with the least amount of, the least that I can. I'm trying to get the most out of a shape with the least that I can. So yeah, now I have that little tail that sticks up right there, and I have a hole for this little air vent, and I have a spout starting point for the gas point. Does that make sense? So I haven't done too much really to this model. It's still very low poly. One of the things we've got to learn to do is be aware of your extrusions, and when you're not extruding it, I'm finding a lot of faces or a lot of edges. So you're basically telling it to extrude, but then not actually moving it. So you're not extruding and then pulling it out or changing it. And what you're ending up doing is extruding and then extruding and then extruding, and you're just building up all of these additional extrusions in this one place, causing problems with edges. When you're selecting edges, they don't flow, or the faces, when you pull out one face, you might see all these weird black thingies happening, because that's called a lamina face. It's a face on top of a face in the exact same plane. It's two pieces of paper on top of one another, basically, only they're not on top of one another, they're literally in the exact same place. And then in order to fix that, what happens is you'll see like an edge, and then you'll grab an edge, and then you'll move that, and then, well, see how it starts to get real weird. It's not weird, it makes sense, but it's hard to see, it's hard to see what all is going on, because it doesn't always look like what you think. And fixing that, especially when you weld the wrong parts to other things. So if you see something like this, or you see edges that begin and don't go anywhere, like this would have a vertex right here in the middle of nowhere, you know, there's a problem and you've got edges and overlapping faces and all kinds of things that you got to fix by either unwinding the faces, like what I've been trying to do is just try to take parts and move them around to find out which is connected, because these are all like dot to dots, right? It's a point and an edge, and to try to untwist it can take a lot of time, and sometimes it's easier to simply just back up, delete a bad section like this, instead of trying to untie it and delete that and start over and just redo it. So I'm spending a lot of time trying to fix problems that are 4 or 5 or 6 extrusions deep, and then they're welded together and all that. And that takes me a half an hour to try to fix it, when maybe easier to just start over. But sometimes you just got to be real careful as you do it. And this is mistakes that everybody makes all the time. But it's just becoming aware of identifying some of the problems. So one of the things you look for when you start to kind of see this, if I was to extrude this, let's see. And then if I was to extrude it again and extrude it again, and then take a face and extrude that, well, what happens is I can see, sometimes you can see edges, thicknesses and edges, or something like this. You'll see how that edge is slightly bigger than that. You probably can't, but when you get used to looking at these things and untwisting stuff, you will be able to see that an edge is slightly larger or slightly different than the rest, and I can spot it. And that's why I say I kind of wiggle the tooth, because I'm just like, well, and I can see that if I go that way, it turns black, and if I go that way, it doesn't, right? So I can push that aside, grab another one, that's black, there's another extrusion. Oh, see how that line is thicker? There's still another one waiting. Maybe not. So there we go. So now I have them separated, and I can either decide, do I want to keep them or do I want to get rid of them? Well, I want to get rid of them. I don't need those. I might, but I don't. So then I can choose all of these and then Control, Delete, and just get rid of it and carry on. So a lot of times I will be looking for that sort of thing when I look at your models. That's why I say keep things really, really, really basic. Yeah, because I've seen many of you have added all kinds of mesh already. You know, maybe you've got several here, and you've put in here and there and everywhere, and there's just this giant network of things holding it together that don't need to be there, and it can cause problems with the way something looks. Like if I see pinching, or you know, if something was missing, this had lamina faces inside of it, I'll fly around inside of my object and try to look around and look for things that shouldn't be there. So one of the things that I want to so if I have two objects that I want to combine together, say if I did two different parts and I need them to be together, I can go up to Mesh and say combine these objects. It makes Maya think like they're two individual objects. I'm going to try to do a quick little demo of lamina faces inside an object. You don't have to do this, but when I'm flying through an object, there's faces inside of here. See these inner faces? We want this to look like a tube, like a balloon animal or something. You know, when you can fly through the whole thing and it's just a big empty hollow shell. And so I should not be seeing any inside faces. Typically that can cause additional what's called tension on the surface of the model. So I would get rid of these by selecting them and deleting them. This is what I should see on the inside of my model, just a big empty pill, you know, just a simple hollow chamber. So actually I can look at this model like I just did, and see how it has this extra flattened part right here? See how it looks like it's been a piece of clay that's been smashed on the table, and it just kind of made that? That's because of that face, that extrusion or additional edges. Edges can be holding it together. So that additional tension on that model can cause it to kind of pull. See how that has that additional edge flattens it? It's because it's pulling that geometry tighter and tighter and tighter to that surface. Remember we were adding edge loops to create what's called a hard edge? That's kind of what is happening. All right. So for now, you've got the basics of this shape, right?
It's not completely right, but it's
No, it's okay.
basic.
I just want to, I don't want to go too far. I'm going to hit Control. I'm going to select my object, hit Control H, and I can hide something. You can actually go up to Display and say Hide or Show, and I just basically said Hide Selection. If I want to show it, I can say Show Selection or Show Last Hidden, and there's my object. Again, that's a quick way to hide something, to get it out of your way. I will also put it on a layer. So hide is Control H, show is Shift H, not Control S. That's save. One of the things that I will do is as I've mentioned before, is I will put something on a layer and I will hide it from view. So one of the ways I can do that is just select my object, and in my channel box, down here there's a layers panel. So I have my channel box up here, and then I have my input information, and then below that I have a layers editor that I can say create a new layer with the selected object, or I can create a layer and add it to it. But I'm just usually selecting the object, and I'll say create a new layer with this selected object applied, and I'll just call this gas can 1. And it's very specific about how it accepts the naming convention. So camel casing and a number, but you can't start it out with a number or have space. So I'm just going to say save, and then that object can be turned off visually by just clicking on this back and forth. So without any help from me, I just want to see how you're able to walk yourself through this process. We already have the reference image up. And what are we going to do? Let's talk about it. Well, we've thought about this already. We've already done it once. But this takes practice. This stuff, workflow and getting through it, it takes practice. So you should look at your kind of game plan, right? So I already decided I was going to start with the cube, or my box, and then I would add edge loops to designate kind of where my extrusions are going to be for the handle up, and then for this back section. It's kind of like the pre-handle back here. And then another extrusion up, another extrusion up, and then I can bridge across these spaces right here. I know that this part is flat and like a cube, but this part angles up. So I'm going to scale that in a little bit and just scale it in. So those are my basic, that's my basic plan. So let's try it again. The tools we're going to use, the insert edge loop. We're going to be able to translate and scale and rotate our components. And we're going to use some bridging or welding, depending on which tool you prefer. All right, I'm going to show you some tools, some different types of tools that we can use to start to harden the edges of this object. Now, I've extruded this, so I'm kind of I already kind of have that, which a couple things that we can use to harden up edges is just to use just add edge loops where we need them. Let me do it with a basic cube for a second. So if this cube, if we were in our proxy mode, you all know that it wants to turn into a rounded object. So since there's barely any geometry on this object, it wants to form into a ball like it is doing right before our eyes. We have this, the real geometry is this cube, the cube, but then if we were to start to smooth it, we would get a sphere. Now by inserting edge loops, we add what's called tension to that mesh, right? So if I add an edge loop here, and the closer I push it to the edge of this edge, the outer edge, the harder or more tension that surface has on that edge has influence on that surface. So I could harden up edges by pulling it with an additional edge. And I could do that to this object and go around and add these edges. And this is essentially like, essentially like adding bevels to it. And we don't want to add too many, but essentially we are getting this nice, in the end we have this nice object that, this is the polygonal version, right? Here's the basic model. If I was to smooth that, control, I'm just going to duplicate it and move it. And if I was to smooth that, because I have those edges there, it ends up having some really nice rounded corners, right? But it gets a lot of extra tension along the edges, which can or may or may not be advantageous all the time. But it does pull and maintain some geometry. Now, another way to do something like this, and this is something you can do on occasion as well, is do what's called adding a crease, or it's called creasing. Don't get it confused with adding a crease like a groove or something. They call it the Crease Tool. So what you do is you use your edges. So if I define these edges here, up across the top, oops, not that one, but this one, and I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, and actually Mesh Tool, actually, don't listen to me, I swear. Does anybody see it? It's right before my eyes.
What are we looking for?
It's called Crease. It's sitting right in front of
Tools, Mesh Tool third.
It's, yes, I see it. Oh, there, okay. So it has this really nice little icon, like little bubble on it, Crease Tool. So the way you do that, you select your edge, you turn on the tool, Crease Tool, and then you hold down middle mouse over the edge, and it will begin to pull that geometry close to that edge. Now I'm going to turn it off by hitting my Q button, and then I'm going to go into my object mode here. And if I go back to 1, it doesn't look like much. It just looks like an object with a thick edge. If I go into 2, it's pulling that geometry to that edge. And if I go into 3, you can kind of see it. So if I went here, and even though it looks like an illusion, if I smoothed it and I began to increase my divisions, look at that beautiful edge that it gives me. I think it's beautiful. You guys might not care for it. But I think it's pretty amazing. I didn't have to actually add an actual piece of geometry, but I'm influencing it. So you can create curved and straight edges with this tool to a degree. I mean, it can be handy in certain cases, okay? It's not always useful, and sometimes it doesn't translate from some software to another software. So if I have creasing in Maya, it may not be transferable to a different software that is looking at importing that model. However, it can work in certain circumstances when you have fairly low pieces of geometry, as I have in this particular case. I might want to add some tension to the edges of my handles in certain places, and just kind of strategically add some edges here and there. And I'm just going to throw it up there so you can kind of see it. And as I drag across, it will pull that edge to it. And so then I can go back and choose that again and drag some more, and drag some more. And so I'm pulling that geometry over in certain places and getting a really nice hard edge there versus I may not want it everywhere, you know what I mean? So making a strategy or pulling in edges where you want them is kind of helpful to harden edges that you might want in certain places. And so adding what's called a crease, they call it a crease tool, can be helpful in some cases to sharpen your edges without adding additional edge loops to your model. And if I decide with my tool on, if I go back over an edge, I can actually select it and I can middle mouse drag to the left and turn it off. So I've selected this edge, it has a crease on it. I have my crease tool on, I'm dragging to the left to take it out, dragging to the right to put it back on. Does that make sense? So you might try to add some creases to certain parts of your model to kind of hold more of what's called a hard side, where it may need to feel like it's not a play school toy and it needs to have a little more of a hard edge. Now I'd want probably a ring around the bottom, but this is really low poly right now anyway. But I can add sharper edges to this by kind of going along and adding those. Does that make sense? So that can get kind of wonky if you don't choose if it doesn't flow. But
this is kind of a really specific question, but is there another shortcut for the middle mouse action? 'Cause I have this on a Mac at home, and to do that
you can't do it without a
yeah, I don't have a
You know what? I will
mouse on my Mac, but
I will look and see. That I don't know. Anybody happen to know if there is one that they've used that before? A Mac without the middle mouse. Let me look and see.
okay.
Because I don't know.
Because I wouldn't be able to do that without the middle mouse, right? Like this.
All right. All right. So today I just want you to work on the body of the gas can. And what I want you to do is keeping the geometry as simple as you can, but still kind of shape it so you can go in and you can form, you can make this a little more unique by shaping things. I'm assuming many of you have seen a gas can of some sort. So you can go in And another thing that I had done on my original model is I added a couple loops, and then I scaled the face down here and made like a ring around this section. Now that's doing that's using the thing that we've been doing where we scale things down in the same plane, and something that people haven't been able to see very well, and something that it doesn't pop up. And let me just show it to you. I'm just going to do a quick insert edge loop real quick. And so when I am, so say I'm going to scale down a certain region of my model in a single plane. If I went up to scale, or I'm sorry, extrude, I don't have a clear indicator of a uniform scale because it only shows me the red, blue, and green tools, but actually there's a fourth one, but it won't show up unless you select one of the cubes already. So the uniform scale tool actually exists there, but it doesn't activate until you click on one of these, and that's this light blue one. Otherwise, I'd have to scale down a little bit in one direction or a little bit in another, but this can also start to deform my model. And there are some issues with trying to do it in plane, or if I try to do it in the world space or in the tangent space. So it's not always particularly easy to do. I just want to be mindful of the distortion of my edges when I do something like that. So notice how if I try to scale that down, my geometry kind of gets a little bit out of alignment. This is where I might go in, take that edge. Oh, I have some additional things in the back. That's part of the reason I had stuff in the back selected. That's why you can't do it in a hurry. So, and I would scale it down to try to line those back up again by taking something that's out of alignment. If I can, use my scale factor in Y and just try to straighten those up, just to keep things going in the same direction. Now this one, if I did something like that, it may not work as well because it may pull some geometry out of alignment, but I might get by with it with this. So not every tool works perfectly all the time. I also had a question about when you select different faces. So for instance, if I use the transform, or if I wanted to move this by just moving the transform tool, if I double click on that, right now it's set up to be moving in the world space, which is Z and X and Y, but I can also change this based on the components that I'm notice how if I go to a component space, it wants to align itself to the tangent of those faces. See how this X is now pointing out at the same angle as the model surface instead of the object, which is more in line with the world or the world. So there are a variety of axis orientation settings that you can choose from, and I often choose them based on the direction that I want to move things, because sometimes I don't want it to be at a weird tangent off the surface. Sometimes I want to just slide something straight up or something straight down. And so I do use this, I change this a lot. And so that is something that I use quite frequently. And another tool that I use a lot, and I'm trying to do a quick demo of this just by so when we were when we were modeling our object, just pretend this is the gas can top, and we did a couple extrusions. I'm going to move that up. So let's say I did one, and then I did another one, and then we were like, oh, it's got this taper on it, right? Well, if I were to try to taper it now, if I scale this group of faces, I only kind of get that group of faces, right? If there was a way for me to be able, when I move this, I also influence some of these other ones as well. And that's done through our tools in what's called a soft selection. Now this is tricky because when this is on, it looks real weird. Things start to look real weird. They get colored. So if you see something like this, it's your first indication that your soft selection is on. And this happens all the time in the beginning when people have it on and it doesn't get turned back off. And I get to that by double clicking on my tools and going down to the soft selection and checking it and turning it on and off. So when I have soft selection on, I'm going to reset my settings. It has a drop off for the amount of influence it's going to give on a surface. So for instance, as I start to reduce this fall off radius to a low number, it changes the color. The hotter the color, the brighter the yellow, and the darker red into black. This is low influence, and this is high influence. So what that means is, as I move this, it's actually going to move the one below it a little bit, or a lot. So if I had a lot of influence, notice that when I scale this one thing, it's also scaling the other things with it. So that's too much. I just want to give a little bit of influence, so I can just start to ease this off a little bit. And as I scale that down, I might get more of a, and let's just, so I can type that in a little bit. I can kind of get a little bit more of a slope, and I can kind of just work with it until I get kind of the influence I want, maybe something like that. All right? Now let me show you a really interesting way to use that that can come in handy for certain things. Actually, on this surface here, when you have a lot of vertices like this, if I was to select a single vertex, like this one, and using my soft selection tool, and the drop-off, you can kind of see the drop-off already. If I change the different profiles of the waveforms, where it's going to have influence, have low influence, have high influence, it actually gives me the ability to raise a whole bunch of geometry at once with the highest influence in the middle, and it drops off. So you can shape things based on these different patterns. And if you were to get crazy about it and just do weird stuff, you can get all kinds of interesting things and experiment with that. And if I didn't like what I was getting, I could make my own. I could reset it and then just add my own and make my own curve and see what that looks like. Oops, looks terrible. Looks terrible. Don't ever do that. And so as I kind of experiment with it, I can get some really neat things, but if you're not aware of what it's going to do, it can freak you out a little bit, so you have to turn it on and off. But it's a nice way to kind of do an overall smooth contour or shaping where you don't have to go into every single little straight edge and shape it. So you can use that to sort of modify your objects. And we did that with the fork. You remember the fork? We did this already, but it's a nice way to refresh and start to use it for your own, for your own uses. So I want you to work on your gas can body, and next week we're going to be making more complex organic shapes like the spout, and we're going to learn how to deform that spout with some tools that'll make it a little bit easier for us to make more unique shapes other than what we just did here. So look at some gas cans, shape that model a little bit, add in some of your own features if you to make it a little bit more unique. Practice, and your applications need to be applications. Like, show me what you're doing with the new knowledge that you have. You learned something, you watched a video, and you made something from it, or you applied it to something. I don't want to see your project one picture saying, oh, I made a light, or something like that. I want you to apply it. If we did it in class, I want you to be doing stuff on your own, and so that you're reading and trying to take what we learn and experiment with it. Experiment other than what we did in class. It's Wednesday, right? We're good? Any questions? I'm going to look at your Project 2 ideas, and we'll make comments to you. I think I have everything other than the last submissions of the applications, and I don't know if I've seen everybody's stuff yet, but I think all Project 1s are graded. So rework them and resubmit, and let me know that you did, so that I can regrade it and look at it again. All right? And you can keep working on those as we go along.
Do you want us to resubmit it in the same
Yeah.
place? Okay.
So just resubmit it and say this is a resubmission, and just upload it to that same Dropbox. Does that make sense? Good?
Tell you when I resubmit it, right?
Yes. Let me know, because it doesn't notify me when someone puts something new in that. All right. Go. Have a good day, everybody.